Okay, Don, why don't we go ahead and get started? So hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of Concourse Connect, our new virtual event series that will allow attendees to engage in practical discussions around the latest cloud security challenges, best practices, insights, and risks faced by security teams. Today, we are diving into security as code, and our host will be industry veteran and thought leader Don Duet, who will introduce himself here in a bit. Please submit any and all questions via the Q&A box, and we'll address them when we do the Q&A session at the very end. That being said, Don, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Sam mentioned, this is going to be the first in a set of episodes that are going to focus on practical strategy and approaches to really enabling institutions to grow and absorb and use cloud in a safe and secure manner. Today, we're going to focus on what is ultimately one of the most important change cycles that we believe is happening in technology. That is the movement towards security as code as the basis for risk management. And particularly in the public cloud. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. One, what is security as code? What does it actually mean? We're going to talk about actually how do people go around and go about building a security as code program and why that's incredibly important. And then we'll talk about some of the fundamental bases of what those components of that program need to be from our experience, both in the corporate enterprise, having helped lead institutions to use public cloud at scale, as well as now working in the field to really work with clients and help them have much more successful adoption of cloud through security as code. So let's start with the most basic question. What exactly is security as code? What does it mean? Like many industry concepts or terms, there could be a lot of different perspectives on that. We really look at it as really having three fundamental components. Number one, it's code. It's ultimately saying shift the way that we think about the application of controls and security into a manner that's actually being codified, that you're writing software in some shape or form to implement and ensure that your objectives and needs from a security and control perspective are being met. And that by default then brings to the second point, which is it's really a shift from moving from a process where, on premise in most of the companies, the ability to operate security and manage security has been very human driven. So this is really shifting from the assumption that people will be doing most of this process to really dividing and creating a model that it's going to support the basis over time for automation of most of your security tasks, most of your functions, most of your verification of control. And then lastly, it's very important to recognize that much of the security as code approach movement and the components of security as code follow very much the basic value propositions we've already seen in industry of DevOps and the shift infrastructure as code. So having the ability to support idempotent declarative artifacts of control, the ability, as we mentioned before, to shift into much more of an automated model and manner is what we are ultimately defining security as code to be. What's also very important is what it's not. And so we very much view security as code, and one of the foundational principles of security as code is that the security code itself is not your business application software. It is not your application data. It's its own data. It's its own intellectual property. By design, it's created in a way that it will operate independently, operate over your business applications, your data. That supports the ability to have both separation of function, that supports the ability to ensure that your control code can be managed, built, and changed at the pace of change necessary from a control perspective. And it supports the ability to really have reuse and scale. So you can build controls that can be deployed across many different applications and data sets, but it is ultimately its own software itself. And that's how we look at the definition of security as code. So why is it important? What's the big deal? Why does this matter? And I think that for many of you who are listening, who have already been part of the migration to public cloud, at least many of the topics that we're going to talk about here are going to be quite recognizable. But fundamentally, as we look at this, public cloud is not just a new technology. It is ultimately a new operating model that many institutions are embracing as they move to digitize more and more of their business. And that operating model comes with a number of different basic principles or assumptions that we see in the world today. One is that really most development organizations are shifting from a waterfall-based approach to delivering and building and deploying software into a model of continuous pipelined and agile software development methodologies. That means changes happen faster than they ever have before, and it means that the amount of changes that are occurring in some are just a much larger number. During our experience at Goldman Sachs, we had over 5,000 independent business applications that were changing, all the time. And the only way that that could be done was embracing the aspect of continuous delivery, continuous build. But the net result of that, of course, was that the amount of things that needed to be inspected, the amount of risk vectors for mistakes or failures was substantially high. Ultimately, from a cloud perspective, there's also just the inherent risk of public infrastructure. There's a lot of debate we could have on, is the cloud safer or less, more safe or less safe than our on-premise experiences. But fundamentally, being in public infrastructure means that you have a public set of challenges, and that the inherent risk of cloud is high. And with the shared accountability model between the consumers of cloud and the actual cloud providers, it's essential that the institutions, as they develop their programs for cloud consumption, are really designing that in a way that they can ensure that they're using the cloud safely, they're configuring services correctly, the amount of information that exists. Even today, there was an article from IBM, which came out saying that almost 2/3 of every issue that has happened from a security vulnerability perspective in public cloud infrastructure was due to misconfiguration. So we've heard that for a long time, and that continues to be a very big challenge. And ultimately, hygiene is the most important piece, right? The ability to ensure that you're doing things right, that you're ensuring that the changes that you make are done correctly. As you said, with all the change cycle growth, with the larger service catalogs that often are employed with public cloud, this needs a new strategy. So that's really what security as code becomes essential. It's also super important, and I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is that security as code is not just a tool, it's not just technology, it's really a strategy, and it needs to be embraced as such. And we are seeing, leading institutions that are really kind of moving towards their multi and hybrid cloud architecture are developing a strategy and a program to really support the shift into security as code. And so we're going to talk about what we're seeing in the industry, what we've learned from our own experiences that ultimately was, enable people to design, build, and deliver comprehensive and successful security as code programs. But at the end of the day, as we said, the why, it's physics, it's the amount of things that are going to change, it's having the ability to enable controls and risk to be moving into much more of an agile architecture that needs the same fundamental approach that we saw in DevOps, that needs the same approach that we've seen in agile development. So just turning quickly, to what are some of the ways to develop as we think about a security as code program. What we've done is really identified 3 principal foundations that we've seen that have been very important in helping clients build and create a security as code program that's robust, that is scalable and adaptive to meet the increasingly changing needs of cloud. And we've defined them as really 3 categories. We'll go through each one of those in a moment. But first is the ability to ensure that you're focusing on ownership and accountability, and have an accountable structure within your own organization. Organizational complexity is very high and creates a lot of challenges in security as code. Second is to ensure that you really have a program and a process to maintain and manage your control IP on an enterprise basis. And then lastly, the ability to really ensure that having now the ability to have policy and security as code, that you really think of it as a security API and you provide the ability to integrate that into many different parts of your environments, from your build all the way through your actual runtime and deployments. So starting with the accountability piece, one of the things that we have absolutely seen in most customers and most people we work with is that the ability to define ownership for control is hard. That many companies have a lot of complexity, different regions, different jurisdictions, different divisions, different teams, and therefore, one of the questions that we are often asked is like, who defines your policy? Who are the actual people responsible for owning policy, owning security, owning control objectives? And it's very difficult often to get answers to that. And so we find that one of the most important things, first off, is to ensure that you really do think of this as a core part of the problem space, and a core and very important part of the successful program is identification of what are the types of roles that you're going to need in your organization, what are the types of responsibilities that come with those roles, and then how do you actually formally ensure that you're maintaining and mapping who the people are, so you know who can write policy, who's allowed to be a policy author or control author, who manages your different forms of controls over which jurisdictions, what do they cover in terms of scope, in terms of region. But this is very much a business problem that needs technology that can help facilitate for it. But it's a fundamental cornerstone to both creating the ability to know, who actually needs to do what, the ability to ensure that you have coverage that really does support your organization, and it creates, the capability, if done well and thoughtfully, to really support the fact that you will have, in most companies, people in different roles that have, the complexity of coverage can be quite high, that you have a scalable basis on which to operate and perform that. And of course, people change jobs and people move to different roles. So having a durable approach to both role and responsibility management for the purpose of security as code is essential. And doing it on an enterprise basis, we could support the ability, therefore, to have people that may be in roles where they're providing global support versus local support is essential in getting to scale and getting to support. So that's our first, principal learning has been that, the absence of effort to really focus and define a accountability model and a role-based structure has led in many cases, as in our experience, for a lot of unfortunate challenges in terms of both who is responsible over what it is, having that into a form that actually enables that to be understandable enterprise-wide has been a critical success factor in driving a security as code program. The second principle foundation that we really have seen is that the ability to design and manage controls really needs to be thought of as an enterprise basis. And so having fundamentally a separation of responsibility and content for what are the controls that you need. We call this the control catalog. And what are the actual implementations of control that actually become the code that reinforces, that does the introspection, that manages to that objective is very important to be maintaining, both in terms of having a separation of content, so a control catalog, which ultimately is your definition of control, and then the relationship of those control catalogs directly to the software, the security as code software that's actually implementing those. We believe very strongly and have seen that one of the challenges as people look to move into cloud and look to fractionalize or to federate ownership of the security as code framework, often comes with the challenge of what software do I have? What is it actually built for? What are the controls that it's actually meeting? And again, given the size and complexity, as we mentioned before, as you start moving into hundreds of teams or applications, not being able to manage that effectively can become a very large problem. Code is code, and software is going to need to be changed. It's going to need to be nurtured. So understanding and having, again, both the definition of who is responsible for that code, but when's the last time it's been tested, when's the last time it's been versioned, that the full aspect of life cycle and managing life cycle is incredibly important. It may sound quite challenging, but ultimately what we've been finding is that the ability to start small, grow as you move forward, and really help clients to adapt and move. But having a core and really thinking about this as software, thinking about it as an enterprise IP, and a collection of this is absolutely a very beneficial part. It has enabled clients to move forward, move fast, and ultimately have a confidence that they understand what are the controls that they have applied, what's the actual code that's backing it, what are the actual findings from that. Getting that into an integrated model, an integrated approach has been a major success, cornerstone of successful security as code programs. And then the last piece, which we'll talk about in terms of the pillar, is, as I said earlier, really thinking about moving and migrating your security and risk approach to really, away from the thought of having a central or single control plane, but thinking about having it as many control planes so that you can move security as an API into many different parts of your application and data life cycles as possible. So supporting both, preventative controls and making sure before you deploy software that it's been validated, going even deeper into the actual software commit-based events, and being able to support ultimately the capability over time to embed into your own development and software lifecycle workflows, the ability to support control planes as a micro plane, but ultimately collectively providing for a much deeper and much more robust approach to software risk. So that, getting that approach in place obviously means that the software and the security as code program needs to think about itself as being almost an API provider and a content provider to many different groups within the organization, providing the integration into multiple parts of the security process and the software delivery lifecycle, and ensuring that not only is it looking at the manufacturing side, but also looking at what actually happens in the cloud. So having an independent view that you can apply your policy over what actually occurred, but doing that in combination with having deeply integrated policy controls through a security API model really provides a capability that we've seen that's been very beneficial. My experience at Goldman, when we first started moving to the public cloud, we began, I think, as many clients do, with just really looking at kind of what's the output, what actually is our state of cloud, how do we make sure we can find as quickly as possible, issues before they become bigger problems, but found very quickly as we started to embrace cloud aggressively, that the ability to obviously deliver a preventative control was a substantially better risk position to be in. But as we took this perspective and ran our SecurityasCode strategy, that having that approach of getting the data managed and maintained, getting that relationship from our control objectives to the actual security code, and then wrapping that with APIs that enabled us to inject it into many different parts of our workflows and our development processes, fundamentally both improved our risk posture, enabled us to have a much better approach to how we would design and think about policy, since we could really modularize many parts of it, and gave us a much stronger basis for growth in the cloud and supporting different services over time in the cloud. So those are the three major pillars. In subsequent episodes of this webinar, we'll obviously go deeper into different aspects of all of this, but where we found, again, where we've seen a lot of success in cloud and people able to avoid failures in cloud have really come, with these three aspects, and really developing, first and foremost, the perspective that SAC is essential and it's strategic and it's an important, direction that companies have to lead. And obviously, leadership, needs to come through people like yourselves on this call that are in responsible positions in the security teams, but really taking that approach and driving a strategy, designing a strategy, and then driving it, that really will help over time the organization be able to move into a SecurityasCode framework has been the major aspects. It's allowed, for the ability to avoid what we would think of as typical failure modes in cloud, the absence of SecurityasCode, the lack of responsibility or definitions of roles in a clear form, the lack of control over the IP base if it's not thoughtfully managed from its integration, from the aspect of cloud, control concepts through control implementation. And then lastly, if the solutions and the controls are so brittle that they don't really allow the business to change, modify, and enhance over time. So if the entire program has not been designed by default to be continuously improving and changing, then that becomes its own failure rate. So those are the three principal pieces. As we said, we wanted to keep this as a small, quick, session to get people up and running. I hope that we've had the chance to give you a sense of both, what is SAC and what do we believe are the major components of the SecurityasCode framework, why is it important, and hopefully giving you some insights into what we've seen has been success factors for companies that have deployed this new strategy in a successful manner. So Sam, I'll hand it back to you and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Don. We have a couple of questions in the queue. Okay, this sounds like the shift we are seeing, but our challenge is going to be scale. Can you please address the approach you took?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we've seen. I think we start often when we think about scale from the perspective of how do I design an approach and a strategy for SecurityasCode that's going to be fundamentally adaptive, that's going to be able to be embraced by many people across my organization. The movement to cloud, often means more people involved in governance and security than less. So how do we ensure that we can support for that? How do we ensure that the program itself is dynamic, that it can, ultimately support change in its own rate? So, a big part, as I mentioned earlier, about SecurityasCode is that the foundational principles of DevOps and infrastructure as code really do create that scale and enable that scale. So, if everything is versioned and managed, if you have identity for your controls, if you have a life cycle around how you can test, modify, change, and deploy controls, these become essential capabilities to support scale. And then on the functional side, as we mentioned before, one of the biggest challenges with deploying security as code in many organizations is that organizational complexity. And so really, focusing in on what is the role and responsibility framework that I want to create for my organization? How do I ensure that there's well-defined ownership and accountability? And how do I do that hopefully on a basis that has an enterprise, technology to it, so that I can really support a lot of transparency, awareness, and really facilitate for the fact that in cloud, again, it'll be a team sport. It's a multiplayer, problem or opportunity to really build and design a strong security program. And so having the technology that supports that and facilitates for that is essential.
Yeah, it's funny. It's actually perfectly aligned to the second question. So maybe we should spend some time talking about this on the next episode. But this question is, you mentioned security as code programs require a collective approach. How do you get individuals to engage in a security as code program design and implementation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I would say that there's no single answer to that. But I would say, one of the aspects of security as code, and again, it is really a strategy, and it's a program. It's not purely a technology, is cultural, that this shift to really have much more of people responsible and accountable, to feel like they're more in control, that there's more own opportunity for empowerment, and that these are ways that help we see that drive a more both a culture that's more inclusive of people being participating and working collectively towards shared goals, like having a secure approach and moving things into an automated framework. That we've seen that it's been very positive from that perspective. Historically, there's often a point of view that you come to a development team or people in your DevOps groups with security issues or challenges that they're going to be running streaming. And I think what we're really seeing with the shift into establishment of the security as code program is that it's really bringing many of the same. It's culturally compatible with the development organizations, with the DevOps organizations. And that really does help a lot with the with driving kind of collective accountability and people wanting to participate.
Yeah, great. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. You've got me interested in security as code. What recommendations do you have for getting started? It's a big question.
Yeah, I think it is a big question, and I think there's a lot of really good materials that you can get on the web. There's a great article by McKinsey on this topic. There's again many kind of examples of surveys that have been done or analyses that have been published in terms of what are the major risks and costs to operating in cloud, that often squarely come back to this topic and to this issue, which is if you're going to be building, managing, and maintaining an increasingly larger amount of software and data as you digitize your business, but having an approach to ensure that your risk and controls are moving in the same path and can operate at the same speed that your cloud is operating at, is both incredibly important to creating the right set of risk practices for a digital business, but also very important in creating business empowerment and outcomes. So I think that when people are looking for how do I get the advocacy in my organization, how do I build the awareness of this, I think that there again are some really good resources out there to facilitate for that. And of course, at Concourse we're always happy to help people understand and give them as much of our insights as possible, again, and what people have been done where we've seen success in developing and establishing and maintaining a successful program.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully this series will be informative and helpful too, to get folks started on their journey. So okay, that wraps up our first episode of Concourse Connect, and everyone will be receiving a copy of the slides presented today, so that will be sent your way shortly. Episode 2 will be on October 13th, and we'll be digging into the components and success stories behind establishing and building a thoughtful and successful security as code program. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Don.
Thank you very much.